loads of interpretations. We hear a lot from employers now about the new normal, which means different things to different people, and causes some anxiety as well, because just as you said, there are lots of opportunities for more flexible working, but also lots of people who can't work at home and don't have the circumstances that's good for them to work at home. So lots to think about there. Now, last but not least, we come to Wes Streeting MP. Wes is MP for Ilford North, and he's also Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, responsible for UK growth and productivity, R&D policy, energy and green infrastructure. So actually right in the middle of this debate. And I guess, Wes, whatever else it's about, it's also always about the money. So over to you.
Yeah, that's right. So thank you, Sue. And it's great to be virtually with you at Tolpuddle. As Darren said at the beginning, I really wish that we were out in the sunshine in Dorset, but hopefully next year. I was just, as I was listening to other speakers, I was trying to think about this question of optimism and how optimistic do we feel? I mean, on one hand, we've got a Conservative Chancellor doing things that we never would imagine a Conservative Chancellor do in a million years. When the job retention scheme was set up, in no small part thanks to not just the pressure, but the active involvement of trade unions helping to design that scheme, I think lots of us were impressed. We never imagined that when we called for the Conservatives to pay people's wages and keep people in jobs, that they would actually do it. We knew it would make a difference. We had to, I think it's fair to say, drag them to doing something for the self-employed as well through the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. But at the start of the crisis, there was a sense that the scale of this was understood and that the response would measure up to the scale of the challenge. But as the passage of time has gone on, I'm becoming less and less convinced that when the Chancellor says he wants to pursue an approach which is, as he describes it, unencumbered by dogma, that he really means it. And it's been interesting in the House of Commons in recent weeks that there are more and more Conservative backbenchers who are vocalising their level of unease, because clearly they're not ready to drop their small state, low tax for the wealthy, unfettered free market dogma, which has left this country pre-crisis with a decade of loss for our economy. You know, we've had a decade of slow growth, low productivity, people's wages not keeping up with the cost of living. This has not been a great decade for our country. And actually going into this crisis, we were less prepared than we might otherwise have been for the scale of the public health consequences. And, you know, in terms of thinking about how we build better, we should ask how it was that we ever as a country allowed so many people to be dangerously exposed to this deadly virus, because we'd failed to deal with the crisis in social care, which has been talked about and debated for more than a decade, and yet so little has been done. We should ask why it was that the government had to spend huge sums building new hospital facilities from scratch, because they failed to properly invest in the NHS for over a decade. And frankly, I think there are lots of people in the country who should be asking why it was that for so many years, not just sections of the media, but sections of the public at large have been calling for more and more cuts to the welfare system, so that going into this crisis with a level of unemployment that we haven't seen in this country for decades, people are now staring into the grim reality of a social insecurity system where, you know, if they find themselves out of work or working on fewer hours, they're not able to make ends meet and provide the basics, a roof over their head, money in the electricity meter, food on the table. And we should also ask how it was, by the way, that we went into this crisis with so many people in work, working all the hours God sends, working more than a normal working week in some cases, and still unable to pay for those basics, because we haven't dealt with, you know, so many of our social problems, the cost of housing, the cost of living, chronic endemic low pay. The fact that, you know, it's what, July, we're more than halfway through the year, and there hasn't been a single prosecution this year from HMRC for employers failing to pay the national minimum wage. And I've failed to believe that there are employers out there who are, you know, who aren't paying the minimum wage. So I think there are so many problems underlying our economy, as Miata said, before we even think about the consequences of this crisis. And it is going to be pretty bad, to put it mildly. We are now facing a degree of structural unemployment in this country that we haven't seen since the 80s. And if some of the projections come to pass, it will actually be even worse. For young people, we know that will be particularly bad. And for them and for the communities in which they live, we've seen in previous recessions the long-term scarring effects of successive recessions. So when the Prime Minister says he wants to build back better, borrowing from some of the language that's been used by campaigning organisations, by Labour politicians like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, when he says he wants to build back greener, when he says he wants to focus on jobs, 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 I mean, literally copying and pasting from Labour's script, there isn't much evidence at the moment that he genuinely means it. I mean, let's just take climate change as an example, something I'm very passionate about. There are policy responses that can do three really important immediate things. They can help keep people in work by providing, home insulation, for example, provides the kind of jobs that people who are losing theirs right now could move straight into, either retrofitting people's homes or going door to door and selling home improvements. That would have the benefit of creating jobs, bringing down the cost of people's energy, and helping us move further towards meeting our climate change objectives. And yet, what the government announced just last week, a £2 billion investment, is less than the £9 billion they promised in their manifesto, which even then wasn't good enough as far as the Committee on Climate Change is concerned. And when the government boasts that we're making more progress than most other advanced economies in tackling climate change, I mean, at least that's got the virtue of being true, which isn't always the case for what Boris Johnson says. But that's not a reflection of Conservative success. It's a reflection of international failure to take the steps we need to tackle climate change. Because unless we make the bulk of the progress that we need to make in this decade, between 2020 and 2030, not the next 3 decades to 2050, the next decade is where it counts. Future generations are going to be cursing ours and saying, how was it that they knew what was coming, they knew what needed to be done, and they failed to act, and they squandered the opportunity and left our planet with irreversible, catastrophic climate breakdown. I mean, this is kind of really big existential stuff. I think the challenge for all of us, I mean, it's a particular challenge for politicians, particularly those who want to win elections so we can do something about it rather than just talk about it. But it's a shared challenge, I think, across the Labour movement and people who genuinely want to see a better country built in the aftermath of this crisis. People don't talk about broken economic models in their daily lives. They don't talk about the need for a paradigm shift or a different model of capitalism. But they do see the consequences of our broken economic model in their everyday lives. They see it when their wages don't pay for the cost of living. They see it when their public services weren't as good as they used to be. And they see it reflected in the societies in which we live through increased rough sleeping and when they fall on hard times, the reality of a social security system that isn't worthy of the name. So we've got to make sure, in terms of our politics and our demands, that we're always connecting with the everyday reality of people's lived experiences and providing really practical answers that give people hope that there are answers to those challenges, and it doesn't all seem far too big and far too scary or far too complicated. And I'm convinced that we can do that. We suffered a terrible election defeat back in December, and in the aftermath, I was left feeling that this is a decade challenge to get Labour back to power. We can't wait. The country can't wait. We've got to work together, pull together as a movement to make sure that we're keeping this government on its toes, holding them to the account, making the best government they can possibly be, but also making sure we've got an alternative and change that people can believe in, so that we've got a Labour government again delivering for working people up and down the country, because that is the only way I think ultimately we're going to be able to build back better, build back greener, and build a better future for people in every part of our country.
Wes, thanks very much. So thanks to the discipline of our panellists, we've got a good 20 minutes or so for Q&A, and we've got some very good questions that have come up. I can't promise that we'll get through them all, but we'll see how far we get. Now, the first question is from Nicholas Patience, and I think it touches on the fact that actually one of the lessons we've learned through this public health crisis is that regulation isn't red tape, regulation is a public good. And Nicholas is asking specifically about the HSE. Let me declare an interest. as a senior official in Prospect. We represent the staff in HSE. And so I have views about this and the union has views. But Nicholas's question is, what are your views, panellists, on the recent initiative by government to get HSE to carry out COVID visits, giving them 14 million in funding to do that, and HSE asking ex-inspectors to go back to work temporarily to be able to do it? So I can see both Darren and Wes nodding. So which one of you would like to have first go at that?
I went first last time, so let Wes go first this time.
Wes.
Thanks, Darren. In fact, I just raised this in Parliament on Thursday because, well, I tell you, it was extraordinary, actually. Even by the standards of answers from ministers, this was a different level as far as I'm concerned. In Leicester, with a local lockdown that they're experiencing and the sorts of factory conditions that were a big part of how the virus erupted again and led to that city being locked down. I think we should be asking really serious questions about what's happened at the HSE over the last decade. And so I did. I said to Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, whether in light of what happened in Leicester, he regretted the fact that the government had cut HSE's budget by 48% and had instructed the HSE to reduce inspections in textiles by a third. He didn't, not only did he not know or recognise the figures and had no idea that the health and safety executive had been cut that far on his watch while he's been a Conservative MP voting for the cuts. He then had the audacity to turn around and blame local councils, clearly unaware that local councils aren't responsible for going in to inspect textiles factories. I mean, there are things that local councils can and should be doing, and probably be doing a lot more if they hadn't had their budget slashed over the last decade. But I just thought this was the height of negligence from the politician who is responsible for health in our country, that he just didn't understand. And even after what happened in Leicester, hadn't even bothered to ask why it was that the health and safety executive hadn't picked up. And, the government is asking more and more people to go back to work and to return to their workplaces. This is a time when we really need the HSE to be able to work with employers, to go into workplaces and to make sure that it is safe for people. And the person responsible for health in our country in the middle of a pandemic clearly doesn't understand the basics and the basic connection between the public health crisis he's dealing with on one hand and workplace safety on the other. And of course, over the last decade, these cuts would have been cheered as the question alluded to and Sue said, cuts to red tape and bureaucracy. This isn't red tape, it isn't bureaucracy. It is the difference between people being safe and well or even alive in their workplaces or not. And I think it's a damning indictment on the government that we're in this place. I also think it's a damning indictment that even when trade union leaders offered to send in workplace reps, train workplace reps to help employers open up, the government didn't take that offer seriously. Len McCluskey made the offer directly, and it's not like Len struggles to get his voice heard. And the government didn't listen. I just think it's negligent. I think it's irresponsible. And I think, again, this comes back to some of the really big questions we need to ask ourselves as a country coming out of this crisis, about our priorities and about, swallowing some of this rhetoric from the right in terms of health and safety and red tape and bureaucracy, because this is where it gets us.
Thanks, Wes. Darren, do you want to comment on this?
I'll just add two minor points. I mean, obviously, I agree with everything Wes has just said, but it isn't just about the health and safety executive, is my kind of broader point. If we had workplaces that had trade union officials in them and employers that didn't block trade union organising in their workplaces, and I have some of these, household brands in my constituency where trade unions aren't allowed in or even kind of recognised in the workplace, then of course these issues would be picked up much earlier on and be dealt with because of collective organising in the workplace. So there's kind of a structural problem on that side, but also the cuts in funding to public health services and Public Health England and our public health directors in local authorities has also meant that we've got very, very small teams with very, very large remits who, by the way, have been working literally 7 days a week since this pandemic has kicked off, and we should pay special tribute to them for their hard work. And so it goes to this broader point that you mentioned at the beginning, Sue, in that red tape is seen as a negative kind of connotation of what is essentially a public framework in which risks are managed. But you can only manage risks if you've got people in jobs and in roles whose job it is to understand and identify those. And if you don't let unions organise and you cut Public Health England and you also cut the Health and Safety Executive, then of course you're going to end up in these situations where you don't have the capacity to respond when you need to.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to come next to Joanne Kay from Bristol, who says, this is the second Zoom meeting where no women have asked questions. Joanne, the good news is some women have asked questions after you, but the question you asked is really valid. And it is, so how can economic recovery support women as workers and also ensure childcare is treated as infrastructure? Miata, can I come first to you on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. A really important question because the economic crisis is going to impact everyone, but we know it's going to impact some groups more than others. We know it's going to impact young people. We know it's going to impact people on lower wages, and we know it's going to impact women. And I think there's a big risk that women who are having to sort of step out of the labour market because of childcare struggle to come back. And so for me, thinking about, and this comes back to the point that one of the things the government has to do is think about how it tailors its intervention. And childcare is an easy win for me. You know, the childcare system was in crisis before the pandemic. It was already on its knees. We have a strange kind of privatized system that doesn't really work. Carers who are doing the most vital work, right? We know that early years intervention and education is profound for life chances of kids. And yet we have carers that are paid terribly. We have awful kind of job retention. So the system was already broken. And the pandemic is making that worse. And actually parents either having to or opting to keep their kids out of childcare settings means that a lot of providers are worried they're about to go bankrupt. So I think the government's going to have to bail out. At the moment, it's been really resistant to try and intervene in childcare. And the thing that we are saying is, you know, we're all about infrastructure spending. Well, their social infrastructure is just as important as the hard kit. It's just as important as the bricks and mortar. And the benefits of investing in social infrastructure, we know it is absolutely critical, both for growth, but also for the resilience of our society. And so one of the things that we think the government's going to have to do, and we're calling for a kind of childcare infrastructure fund, and we use the language of infrastructure on purpose, is to try and pump money so that childcare providers can cover the cost of both their staff, but also their overheads. And in return, we are saying they should be providing childcare for free, which we hope starts to tip us closer to the sort of universal childcare system that we see, for example, in Scandinavia. And in the end, I think is the sort of system that we have to get to if we're serious about high quality childcare that allows parents into the labour market.
Thanks, Miata. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question, which, Joanne, it's directed at you initially. Others may wish to comment. And it's picking up on your points about workers being treated fairly. But the questioner, who is Richard, is saying, well, workers aren't being treated fairly. They're being made to pay by businesses for the crisis. And he specifically cites workers at Heathrow Airport who've been told they could be dismissed if they don't accept voluntary pay cuts. And I think we've seen further stories, including British Airways seeking to do this in the media today. And it is the reality for too many workers. So, Joanne, initially, others who may want to comment, do you agree that it's only trade union action that can actually protect jobs in those circumstances?
Well, it's a really, really good question, and absolutely that that there are some terrible stories of complete industries and sectors that are really struggling and will continue to for some time, and that inevitably jobs will be lost as a result of this. And I think we can't get around that. What I think is important, I think there's two things: there's the what and there's the how. And of course, we've heard already lots of debate around what the government are doing to try and support businesses, and it's clear that not every business is going to be able to be supported, so that it doesn't need to lose people. But the more the economy can do to protect jobs, absolutely that's key. So minimising the what as far as we can in sort of UK PLC is clearly important. But then there's the how, and certainly from my perspective, how businesses go about doing this, I think is really important, because in the future, if they are to remain an employer, how they treat people in really tough times, I think goes an awfully long way for their longer term reputation. And so whilst I think that the unions absolutely have a role, because I think it's important for the workers, the employees, to be able to speak up, and if on an individual basis that's not easy and possible to do, particularly in large businesses, then obviously there is a key role to play by the unions to enable that voice to be heard. So I think there is a responsibility on people to speak up and give suggestions, ideas. I talked earlier about creativity and innovation. I think people who have got a lot of experience in their sector have a perspective and can share that in this challenge or problem of looking at needing to perhaps reduce roles or change the way business is done in certain sectors. And then I think there's a real responsibility on the employer to listen, to ask their people, we've got this problem, we need to do something to fix it. How can we work with you to ensure we do it in a way that is as respectful as possible, as inclusive as possible, and as fair as possible. Treating people with respect and fairness. I think if there's a difficult outcome at the end of it, that may not always be able to be avoided, but it's done in a way that is respectful of people and their circumstances. So I think the other obligation on organisations and businesses that are challenged in this way is to really look creatively. And we saw some of these examples earlier on in the pandemic, where whole sectors of the aviation industry were focusing on, well, I can't work here, but maybe I can help, in the Nightingale Hospital, for example. And I think that creative thought process, and I think there is an obligation on organisations to be creative and to support people who may not be able to continue working for them. But, we talked earlier about the fact that we've got these fantastic tools available to us at the moment. It's very cheap and easy to put on a webinar or a seminar like this, over a Zoom call, for example. Why not use that tech to help our people if we're having to ask them to change the way they do things, or indeed look for alternative work? What role can we play in doing that? So I think for me, there's a sense of shared responsibility. This is a problem that we've all been faced with, and the more respectfully we can deal with it, the more we can listen to people and take creative ideas forward. I think we as a population will handle it in a more robust way that sets people off for the future in the best way possible. But we can't get away from the fact that some organisations are having to make some really difficult decisions, and I think it's really important that people are enabled to have their say in that.
Thanks, Joanne. Actually, I'm going to move on. I'm going to roll two questions together, and these are questions about what the future might look like. So Alexa Phillips is asking, what kind of specific policies can prevent mass unemployment, and how do we pay for them without a return to austerity? Or should we accept that many jobs will be lost and invest in the creation of new jobs, for example, green construction jobs and mitigation strategies such as universal basic income? And in a similar vein, Chris Jones asks, is the Labour Party preparing an alternative vision of what it wants to be done around which to positively campaign? And specifically, does that include re-resourcing local government? Darren, can I come first to you on those?
Yeah, of course, although I should put down the disclaimer, I'm merely a humble backbencher, so I'll let Wes answer the question from the front bench about what the Labour Party's kind of policy development is from that perspective. I mean, in terms of I touched a little bit about on this in my opening remarks, which is, there will be changes in workplaces and businesses. And I think the one thing that we need to be conscious of is that the biggest employer in the country is the SME sector, and it accounts for about 99% of jobs across the British economy. And SMEs often, in my view, get overlooked in terms of kind of the big policy announcements from government. and they're much less resilient than big businesses because there's less of them, they've got less cash flow, they've got less kind of things to be able to pull in to help give them stability when you're in the middle of a recession. And so that's one reason I've been calling for additional support from government for SMEs, but also to try to find mechanisms where, you know, the big household name companies are also able to share some of the benefit that they're getting with their supply chains to try to keep that resilience in the workplace. And that's just one example of what I referred to as the kind of stabilizers. And that's the really important role for the state. You know, this is a state-sponsored economic recovery in a way like never before, and that should come with conditionality for businesses, both in terms of creating new roles. So thinking about, you know, if you're in the aerospace sector and you want to create the wings of the future and you want to create lighter materials or think about kind of cleaner flights, you know, priming that investment now and making sure that workers are transitioning into those jobs now, so that when that market becomes more available in the future commercially, you're kind of ready to take off, excuse the pun, that wasn't intended, into that kind of sector of the economy. Also, again, on supply chains, we know that productivity is a real problem because lots of businesses haven't been able to digitize or improve their processes using technology. Big businesses are very good at this. Why can't we make tweaks to the apprenticeship levy to allow big businesses to spend that and put the people who have done that in their organizations into their supply chain to help their suppliers and partners to also go through that transformation, again creating new types of jobs and new types of workplaces. So there's things you can put into that around conditionality that that can really, I think, work for people. And Wes has already talked about the low-hanging fruit from obvious policy decisions like energy efficiency funding and how that creates jobs for people in every single part of the country, as well as transitioning on to net zero, which is important. And just very, very briefly on the last question, because it's related to this question, I've long been talking about the new relationship between the state and business. And businesses are talking about that now. I mean, as chair of the business committee, I've been on webinars with the British Academy, with the Financial Times, with the Institute of Directors, and they're all talking about the future of the corporation and the way in which businesses have to manage this new relationship with the state so that it works in all of our interests. And where businesses are acting in good faith, that should be encouraged, and we should collaborate on that and understand where public funding and private funding can kind of get the outcomes that we need. But ultimately, when businesses are acting in bad faith, and I think BA is an example of this, there does need to be enforcement. You know, there needs to be a stick as well as a carrot for this transition. And we've seen, you know, Keir Starmer raised this in Prime Minister's questions last week, and the government basically just ignored the question. If the government doesn't attach conditionality to support for companies that make sure that their kind of approach to workers is inclusive and fair and just, then some businesses aren't going to do that. And again, that then comes down to the question of trade union power, because if individual workers haven't got the power and the state's not willing to do anything and the business can get away with it, you do need that collective organizing. And so you can start to see how through public policy, you pin all of these pieces together and you start to have a kind of framework in which you can help workers in parts of the country have more power, more say, more opportunities for skills and development, more opportunity to transition into new work in their local communities. And I just think that's, I hope I'm not being naive, but that seems perfectly achievable to me. And it's very distressing, and hence Wes's point about better for us being in government than in opposition, to keep raising these points, these credible points to the government, and they just kind of ignore you. But anyway, I'll let Wes talk about the official Labour Party stuff, because he's better qualified than I am at that.
Before we get there, and just conscious of time,
Hi everybody, sorry we've had to cut that session short. I hope you enjoyed it, but we're ready to go to the next session, which is the Black Lives Matter session. It's going to be a really good one again. We've got a brilliant lineup, but first, before we nip into that, we're going to have a little chat just amongst some of the people behind the scenes working on Tolpuddle. By now familiar faces, I'm sure. Hello everybody.
Hello everybody.
How have you been finding it?
Wow, I mean, it's been really exciting, hasn't it? But compared to I would call it the regular festival, for want of a better word, where we would have thousands of people actually here, then, you know, that is obviously sad. And we are looking forward to next year when we can really properly meet up again.
But we wouldn't have your shopping channel, Tom. Can you tell us what's coming up on the shopping channel?
Well, I think we've got a few products that we haven't seen yet. I think the shopping channel do have a fabulous selection of badges that we need to have a look at. So that's one for Joe Solo to look out for, to add to his collection. And we've also got some headgear, some stylish headgear to wear.
How's the TUC Southwest HQ doing?
Oh, very good. It's a hive of activity here. Yeah, everyone's working hard behind the scenes. Good atmosphere. It's a little bit like being at the real thing, you know. Everyone's helping each other out, having a bit of a laugh, working very hard. Haven't found anyone asleep by a photocopier yet. So,
you pleased with the music so far, Kev?
Yeah, brilliant. And it's been great to see all the comments that people leave when there's an act on, and just encourage that really, to say if you're watching something and you're enjoying it, leave a comment, because I'm sure that the acts are actually tuned in and watching and seeing what's going on. And yeah, the music coming up is looking really good as well today and tomorrow. So even though it's a different format this year, we've put a lot of effort into making sure the quality's been really high, and a lot of diversity in the music as well, to keep you entertained.
I love the scribes.
Oh, the scribes were amazing, weren't they?
So good.
Yeah.
Not a guitar amongst them. Blokes, but no guitars. Excellent.
It's been good. I think that they played Tolpuddle last year, I think it was, and it's nice to have had some returning acts that maybe people missed before because they were at a talk or at the other stage. So there has been a chance for people to check out bands that maybe they missed before.
I understand there's a returning act that's really good coming back about 5 o'clock.
So, who would that be? I'll just check my notes.
Don't miss the skimmities.
Yeah, I better get changed actually quite soon, because I've got to be back in my house.
Badger outfits. You still have the badger outfits, the skimmities?
Yeah, it didn't make an appearance, I don't think, but there's still time.
I understood that people at home are getting dressed up as badgers, especially for the occasion.
And posting up their pictures.
Yes.
No, that would be something, wouldn't it?
Well, the challenge is
2020, I want to see all of those.
Yeah, a badger chase in the comments. That's the challenge, isn't it? We want to see someone actually running up and down the road dressed as a badger.
There you go. There's the challenges.
There will be a prize donated from the Tolpuddle shop.
I say though, the warning is: do watch out for traffic and angry farmers. Just we don't health and safety. Remember,
dress as a badger responsibly.
Brian May is particularly encouraged to join in with this, as we'd love to see that.
Yes. Anyway, we're going to have to go now, so we're going to break the Facebook stream again. Very sorry. Oh, hello, Inez.
Hi.
And before we join the Black Lives Matter session, so go and grab a quick cup of tea, refresh your Facebook, but make sure that you join the next session. Thangham Debonair MP will be introducing a great range of speakers for a very important subject, which we're going to hope to stay with for as long as we can. So come back soon. Thank you very much.
See you later.